Hello, my dear friends. Tonight we'll lift the veil on the truth together. The world of the most notorious nuns in medieval history. Some of them not only broke their religious vows, but even used their very habits to conceal their own sinful deeds. Reality shows us that sometimes the most frightening villains are the ones society believes to be the most holy. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. And as always, let me know where you're listening from, your location and local time, so I can see who tonight's journey is connecting through the mist of history. Now then, turn off the lights, curl up under a warm blanket, and let us ease ourselves into tonight's journey together. If you've ever thought that medieval convents were filled only with gentle nuns quietly reading prayers, then the story of Benedetta Carlini will make you reconsider. This was not only the most notorious religious scandal of 17th century Italy, but also one of the rare cases in which a nun was recorded in church archives as the worst ever known. The remarkable thing is that this story is not a legend. It is true, documented line by line in the bishop's records over several decades. When Benedetta entered the convent, she was not like the other nuns. Instead of quietly following the daily schedule of prayers, Benedetta repeatedly appeared with holy signs. She claimed to see angels, hear the voice of God, and receive direct divine guidance. Such claims, if they happened today, would likely be questioned immediately. But in the deeply religious context of the 17th century, they instantly drew the attention of the entire convent, and Benedetta took full advantage of that attention. Over time, she came to be regarded as the chosen one. Her trances grew more frequent. Her visions became more detailed, and at the same time her influence within the convent increased. There were days when Benedetta claimed that an angel had instructed her on how to manage convent affairs, assign duties, or even remind other nuns to obey. No one dared to contradict someone who claimed to receive messages from heaven, and that was the beginning of the power imbalance within the Pescia convent. But then, the unusual signs began to surface. A young nun, the one who lived closest to Benedetta, said she'd been forced in silence, and everything was covered up with phrases like, "This is God's will," "The angel is acting," or "You must obey to be saved." Medieval society had no language to describe concepts of abuse as we do today, but the testimonies left behind make one thing unmistakably clear. Benedetta exploited her spiritual authority to control and harm others. When rumours spread, the church could not ignore them. A bishop's committee was formed to investigate, and as soon as they began questioning each person, matching testimonies emerged. The nuns spoke of occasions when Benedetta pretended to be possessed by an angel. They described how she created supposed holy wounds on her body, which were later confirmed to be self-inflicted. Pages upon pages of interviews detailed the manipulation, the threats, and the things Benedetta had hidden for years beneath the facade of devout piety. The longer the investigation continued, the clearer the truth became. None of the miracles were real. No angel ever spoke. Everything was orchestrated for the sake of power. Once all the truth was laid on the table, Benedetta's punishment was severe. The church declared her unfit to be a nun, stripped her of all positions, and imposed a special form of confinement, complete isolation in a small room within the convent. No teaching, no communal worship, no contact with anyone without explicit permission. And that punishment lasted more than 30 years. She lived in that cramped room until her death, almost erased from convent life. A nun, someone who was supposed to represent humility and virtue, became a manipulator, a deceiver, and someone who exploited faith to serve her own needs. A convent, a place meant to be peaceful and quiet, became the centre of a scandal that spanned decades, and a woman, imprisoned until her death, left behind a haunting question. Was she a villain, or also a victim of the extreme religious environment of her time? No one has a completely definitive answer, but the case of Benedetta Carlini serves as a stark reminder. Even in an age full of faith, people can still be swept away by the seduction of power, and sometimes the stories behind convent walls are far more complex, darker, and more thought-provoking than the surface of history ever reveals. Joan of Leeds, or Joan of the City of Leeds, is a remarkable case of someone who did something previously unheard of within the monastic life of medieval England. Her story is recorded in the registers of the Archbishopric of York, and although it appears only in a few lines, it is enough to reveal an entire world of pressure, suppressed desire, and the true daily life inside a convent that history books often overlook. Joan was a young nun belonging to St Clement's Priory in York, one of the larger convents for women at the time. Essentially, a convent was a place of quiet, of regular prayer, and of a discipline that most women entering it were expected to follow for the rest of their lives. But not everyone entered a convent willingly. The 14th century was a time when many girls were placed in convents not by choice, but because their parents could not afford a marriage dowry. And this meant that monastic life became a refuge for both the willing and the unwilling. Joan belonged to the latter group. There are not many records describing her personality, but what happened afterwards shows that Joan was not someone easily subdued. She was the exact type of young woman a convent silently feared, a nun with a restless heart, someone who still held very human desires that religious vows were not strong enough to extinguish. This became the spark for one of the boldest escapes ever recorded in the history of English monasticism. According to the York Register, Joan constructed a fake corpse in her own coffin, leading everyone in the convent to believe she had died. There are no details describing how that fake body was made. Historians speculate that it may have been a straw figure, covered in cloth and placed under flickering candlelight. What is notable is that this plan was not impulsive. It required time, observation, intelligence, and a great deal of daring for a young nun to pretend to be dead inside a convent. This exceeded the boundaries of every rebellious act found in ecclesiastical documents. And when the funeral bell tolled through the convent, when the nuns gathered to pray for the soul of the departed, Joan quietly walked out through the convent gate, leaving behind a life she had never chosen. The York records state that Joan fell because of carnal desire, a familiar phrase medieval churchmen used to describe those who left monastic life for love. In modern terms, it simply means she escaped to be with her lover, a man who, according to the bishop's wording, had led her into a life of depravity. Church language was always judgmental, but from today's perspective, we understand that Joan simply wanted to live an ordinary life, to have love, to have choice, to have a future not locked behind convent walls. It is not hard to imagine Joan's state of mind before her escape. A mixture of fear, excitement, and a desperate yearning to break free from a predetermined life. For centuries, convents have often been described as peaceful places, but for those who did not want to be there, the stone walls could feel more like a prison than anything else. No going outside, no romantic love, no control over one's life, every hour scheduled, every thought expected to align with doctrine. For a young woman, this could indeed feel like captivity. Thus, Joan's escape was not a betrayal of faith. It was a rebellion against an environment in which she could not breathe. Her act of constructing a fake corpse was not an insult to religion, but simply the only method she could think of to leave the convent without being stopped immediately. After the truth was discovered, the Archbishop of York ordered the convent to search for Joan and bring her back to the path of virtue. But the documents do not specify whether Joan was ever found. Some historians believe she succeeded in her escape and vanished from the church's records. That means that, in just a few brief lines, Joan may have achieved what many women of her time could not, escaping a life imposed upon her. Joan's story fascinates modern historians and listeners because it opens a window into the real conditions of medieval convent life. Behind the solemnity were lives forced into obedience. Behind the vows were natural human emotions that not everyone could suppress. And behind the seemingly unchanging habits were individuals who still had wishes, hearts, and the desire to determine the course of their own lives. What makes this story compelling is not its dramatic nature, but its deeply human one. Joan was neither a hero nor a villain. She was simply a young woman who wanted to love and to live authentically. The fact that she chose such an extreme method, feigning death, to obtain her freedom shows the suffocating pressure many nuns in similar circumstances endured. Today, when researchers mention Joan of Leeds, they call her many things. The runaway nun, the rebellious nun, the girl who faked her own corpse to follow love. But perhaps the most accurate, the most fair title is far simpler. Joan, the woman who dared to reclaim the life that belonged to her. In the history of medieval Germany, few places provoke as much curiosity as Quedlinburg Abbey. Once regarded as a small principality nestled within the Holy Roman Empire, what made Quedlinburg unique was not its architecture or sacred legends, but the very women who ruled it. Abbesses who possessed power equal to that of dukes, women who could issue decrees, collect taxes and command troops, causing the nobility of the time to tread carefully around them. Their lives were nothing like those of ordinary nuns. They resembled the lives of rulers dressed in religious robes more than those of women living quietly within a convent. It all began in 936, when Queen Matilda founded Quedlinburg Abbey in memory of her husband, King Henry the Fowler. This abbey was of a special kind. The abbess had to be of noble or royal birth, and upon taking office she not only led the religious community, but also became the feudal lord of the vast land surrounding it. Because of this, their paths always began in luxury, born into powerful families, carefully educated and raised to wield authority rather than live in asceticism. Abbess Matilda Thuror was one of the first to embody this power fully. The granddaughter of Emperor Otto Van, she entered Quedlinburg not as a young nun but as a leader. She collected taxes from merchants, owned agricultural estates, oversaw blacksmiths and farmers, and had the authority to settle local disputes. People had to report to the abbey, and all important economic activities fell under her control. For a woman living in the 10th century, this was extraordinary power. But great power always brought controversy. After Matilda came several other abbesses who continued the fusion of religious and political authority, making their lives resemble those of secular lords. One of the most notable figures was Abbess Agnes in the 12th century. Her life clearly demonstrates how power could distort the morality of a convent leader. Agnes became abbess at a young age thanks to her powerful lineage. She ruled over more than 10 villages, held the authority to appoint local officials, and controlled most of the abbey's income from markets. But not long after, she was accused of corruption, distributing abbey lands to her relatives and accepting bribes from noble families. The church launched an investigation. The local people grew resentful, but backed by her family's influence, she kept her position until her death. Her passing was not recorded with praise, but with the relief of locals because an unfinished investigation had finally come to an end. A century before Agnes, Abbess Adelheid had lived an even more extraordinary life. During the Saxon conflicts, Adelheid was entrusted by the emperor with command of local military forces, something ordinary abbesses would never experience. She had to confront peasant uprisings, territorial disputes among nobles, and even once ordered the suppression of a rebellious noble faction. Adelheid was described as tough, unyielding, even cold-hearted. Locals called her the Duchess in a habit. Throughout her long leadership she was never beloved, but her authority was strong enough to silence all opposition. She died while still in office, at a time when the people were exhausted by her iron-fisted rule. After Adelheid and Agnes, Quedlinburg continued to be led by abbesses of complex temperament and turbulent lives, resulting in numerous scandals. Abbess Jutta, in the 13th century, was recorded as someone who squandered the abbey's wealth on banquets for nobles she wished to befriend. A church investigation revealed losses so great that Quedlinburg nearly went bankrupt. Although reprimanded, Jutta kept her position until her death, because no one of sufficient power existed to replace her. Nearly a century later, Abbess Sophia plunged the abbey into crisis in another way. During economic hardship, she raised taxes across the board to compensate for overspending. The people became so enraged that small-scale revolts broke out. Sophia had to use the abbey's military forces to suppress them, increasing public resentment even further. When she died, the locals left no positive records about her. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the abbess's power gradually declined. The spread of religious reform led the church to tighten control. The final abbesses of Quedlinburg no longer had the authority to levy taxes or command troops as their predecessors had. They became only spiritual leaders in a convent that had lost most of its lands. Their lives ended quietly, with no more political power and no more dramatic scandals. Looking back at its entire history, the lives of Quedlinburg's abbesses form a clear arc. They were born into power, entered the abbey as if ascending a throne. They ruled as feudal lords, entangled in disputes, corruption, and even warfare. And then, eventually, the system shifted and their authority faded, leaving behind stories both astonishing and thought-provoking about women whose power far exceeded medieval expectations. These were not merely nuns, but historical figures who lived fully between two worlds, religion and politics. And it was this very collision that created the title future generations would give them: The Wicked Abbess of Quedlinburg. In the religious history of 12th century France, Fontevraud Abbey is often mentioned as one of the largest and most famous communities of nuns in Europe. It was the burial place of members of the English royal family, a major religious centre under the Plantagenets, and long regarded as a symbol of sanctity and discipline. Yet beneath that solemn exterior lay a scandal that once forced the church to investigate in secrecy. Accusations that the nuns of Fontevraud had poisoned, tortured, and brutally punished one another. These records appear in several 12th century French documents, giving the renowned abbey a darker layer that later generations cannot ignore. The story began when a group of church officials recorded accusations concerning the behaviour of certain nuns at Fontevraud. According to the documents, they were suspected of secretly using poison to eliminate fellow sisters, whom they considered ungodly or disruptive to discipline. You will see, for in a large abbey like Fontevraud, differences in class, upbringing and temperament always simmered with tension. The abbey housed not only common-born nuns but also noble women sent there either for moral training or to avoid unwanted marriages. Living together in a closed environment where words held the weight of law and discipline trumped personal emotion, internal conflicts could easily escalate to extremes. According to the sources, the poisonings usually took place quietly. A young nun suddenly fell ill after a meal, another collapsed during prayer, another grew weaker over several days until she died. All were recorded as natural illnesses, a common description in an age when medical knowledge could not explain many symptoms. Yet strangely, most victims were nuns known for issues with discipline, often reprimanded or harshly punished by their superiors. The pattern of deaths among the same group raised suspicions among some officials that these were not accidents, but the work of other nuns within the abbey. The documents did not stop at poisonings. They also describe extreme punishments inflicted on disobedient nuns. Some were locked in dark rooms for days, some beaten with ropes, and others forced to kneel for hours in the winter cold. These methods went far beyond ordinary disciplinary measures. According to one account, a nun was punished to the point of exhaustion and died in solitary confinement, making it impossible for the matter to remain hidden. This raises the question, what could cause a place considered holy to become an environment capable of such violence? To modern historians, the answer is not difficult to understand. Fontevraud was a massive abbey with a strict hierarchical system, comparable to a miniature city. In such closed communities, power struggles among groups of nuns were inevitable. Everyone was required to live under rigid discipline, with clearly divided duties and ranks. Some nuns, especially those of noble birth, were accustomed to privilege and not easily accepting of absolute obedience. Meanwhile, the senior nuns often viewed those who did not fit as threats to the order they struggled to maintain. All these elements created conditions in which violence could take root. However, it is also necessary to consider that many documents may have been exaggerated. The 12th century was a period when the Church frequently wrestled with debates about whether monasteries were maintaining proper discipline. Some reformist groups sought to prove that overly large monastic communities were prone to corruption, and Fontevraud, an all-female abbey comparable in size to a small principality, was an easy target. Thus, some accusations may have been embellished or written from a biased viewpoint. But exaggeration or not, the existence of these records highlights an important truth. Medieval monasteries were not always peaceful, nor did they always reflect the ideals described in Scripture. Behind prayers, liturgical chants, and silent stone walls lay the reality that humans, with all their ambition, fear, jealousy, and anger, brought their entire nature with them when they crossed the abbey gate. In the end, no public verdict was ever announced. The matter quietly concluded after an internal investigation. Some nuns were transferred elsewhere, others placed under special supervision, and Fontevraud's disciplinary structure was tightened. The abbey continued for centuries afterward, but from that moment its reputation carried a shadow that history could never fully erase. Today, when looking back at the Fontevraud scandal, historians are unsure what the absolute truth is, but the surviving documents are enough to remind us that even in the communities believed to be the most sacred, humans can cross the line between discipline and cruelty, between doctrine and power, between devotion and fear. Fontevraud was not the first, and certainly not the last abbey, where the darkness of human nature seeped into the nightly prayers. Among the witchcraft trials of late medieval France, the story of Jeanne de Brigue, which took place in 1390, is one of the rare cases directly involving a nun. What made this case remarkable was not only the accusation of summoning spirits and using charms, but also the way it exposed the fragile boundary between religion, superstition, and power in an age where any behaviour outside accepted norms could easily become a mortal sin. Jeanne de Brigue was born and raised in northern France, at a time when society was deeply unsettled in the aftermath of the Black Death. With loss everywhere, people turned to forms of folk belief, fortune-telling, herbal medicine, and rituals of communicating with the dead. Jeanne, according to several sources, was known for healing illnesses through traditional methods, sometimes combined with prayers and pre-Christian rites. These techniques were common among rural communities, and in many places women like Jeanne were considered essential to local life. Yet when a woman with such skills entered a convent, everything became far more complicated. Jeanne did not enter the convent to withdraw from the world, but, according to some records, to seek economic stability. Many women at the time chose this path because they had no family protection or had been widowed. Within the convent, Jeanne continued to treat people in the surrounding area, and sometimes even her fellow nuns. This gained her a reputation, but it also drew the attention of those who believed her methods were not in accordance with doctrine. When several illnesses were cured through the herbal remedies and unusual prayers Jeanne used, some of the other nuns took it as proof that she possessed powers. In a strictly religious environment, a nun with spiritual authority outside that of the church was often viewed as a threat. The situation escalated when a man named Guillaume Frelon testified that Jeanne had once helped him perform a ritual to summon the spirit of a deceased relative. This statement appears in the 1390 records of the Paris court, and it became the central evidence for the entire case. Guillaume described how Jeanne drew symbols, burned herbs, and recited prayers to call the spirit. To the church, this was dangerous, evoking associations with black magic, something medieval theology claimed could lead a soul into the hands of the devil. Worse still, Guillaume testified that Jeanne had once given him a charm intended to make someone change their mind. Whether this charm was symbolic or merely a packet of herbs is unknown, but for a religious court its mere existence was enough to accuse Jeanne of manipulating human will through sorcery. When Jeanne was summoned before the court, she had no means to defend herself. The Paris court of the period did not operate through debate as modern courts do. Accusations were often treated as strong evidence, and defendants were pressured to confess to avoid harsher interrogation. In the records, Jeanne is described as a nun involved in magic, necromancy, and charms, and that was all that was necessary to place her in grave danger. From a modern perspective, Jeanne's actions belong mostly to the realm of folk healing and common spiritual practices of the time, not to malicious sorcery. But in 1390, when religious belief held absolute authority, anything outside doctrine was viewed as a direct threat to church power. Jeanne became a textbook example of that conflict. The trial progressed quickly. The court examined the church's prohibitions on magical practices, including the statement that summoning spirits is an act guided by the devil. They argued that if Jeanne did not see her actions as sinful, that itself proved she was not aligned with doctrine, a serious offence for a nun. Although several people who'd received her healing pleaded for leniency, their voices were dismissed. Ultimately, the court cared less about what Jeanne had actually done, and more about the fact that she acted outside church-approved authority. Jeanne de Brigue was sentenced to death, the punishment then reserved for those believed to practice high-level witchcraft. The execution was carried out by burning at the stake, the common method for crimes related to sorcery in late medieval France. She was executed in 1390, ending the life of a woman who likely sought only to heal and help others in the way she knew. Her fate reveals a stark truth. The boundary between religion and superstition in the Middle Ages was perilously thin. A single, unfamiliar healing method, an unusual prayer, or a misinterpreted folk ritual could turn a woman into a criminal before the church. Jeanne was not the only case. She was simply a victim in a time when religious authority sought to control every aspect of spiritual life. Today, when historians speak of the Jeanne de Brigue trial, They regard it as a striking example of the clash between folk tradition and institutional religion. But for the listener, what remains is the image of a modest woman swept into a storm of fear and authority, ultimately paying with her life. Jeanne was not a witch. She was a victim of an age that could not distinguish between belief, folk knowledge, and what it labelled sorcery. The 1390 trial spans only a few pages in the records, yet it is a long story about fear, ignorance, and the way a human being was crushed by the very system she once trusted. In the religious history of 17th century France, the possessions at Loudun became one of the strangest and most terrifying scandals, not only because a large number of nuns claimed to be possessed by demons at the same time, but also because it led to a wrongful execution that modern historians still regard as a tragedy born of fanaticism, psychological pressure, and political manipulation. The events took place between 1632 and 1634 at the Ursuline convent in the town of Loudun, and at the centre of the story was not a nun, but the parish priest Urbain Grandier, who was turned into an unwilling villain in a drama he could not escape. The Ursuline convent at Loudun consisted largely of young nuns, many of whom had been placed there by their families not out of devotion, but out of tradition, or because they could not be married off. Its strict education, quiet environment, and isolation from the outside world made their inner lives easily shaped by fear, pressure, and melancholy. Toward the end of 1632, strange behaviours began to appear. Some nuns screamed during the night, others said they saw demonic figures in their rooms, and some even spoke in strange voices they claimed were the language of demons. News spread quickly, and before long the entire convent was engulfed in chaos. The first to claim possession was the Mother Superior, Jeanne des Anges, a woman of frail health who frequently struggled with the psychological strain of leading a young convent. She said she'd been visited by a man in a dream who approached her with wicked intentions. When asked who the man was, Jeanne named the parish priest Urbain Grandier, a clergyman known for his intelligence and powerful preaching, but also notorious for his pride and past conflicts with local authorities. The accusations soon spread to the other nuns. One claimed a demon had strangled her. Another insisted she heard whispering within the walls. One collapsed in the chapel, convulsing and screaming, "The devil is taking me!" From a modern perspective, these symptoms strongly resemble mass psychogenic illness, something that arises easily in tense, enclosed environments influenced by spiritual authority figures like the Mother Superior. But at the time, the only explanation anyone considered was a real demonic invasion. As news spread, curious crowds began to gather. The convent held exorcisms lasting several hours, during which the nuns cried, spoke in unnaturally deep voices, and sometimes hurled wild accusations. The exorcists asked, "Which demon torments you?" And the nuns, in states of extreme stress, responded with frightening names they knew only from books. Some even screamed that Urbain Grandier was the one who had opened the door for demons to enter the convent. Grandier quickly became the focus of the panic. He already had enemies within both the church and the local government, especially among Loudun's city officials who disliked his self-assured, almost arrogant manner. This long-standing resentment was soon transformed into justification for his arrest. Although Grandier consistently denied all accusations, he was imprisoned and subjected to intense interrogation. Investigators demanded he confess to using sorcery to seduce and manipulate the nuns, something he insisted he had never done. One of the most controversial elements of the case was the so-called Pact with the Devil, a document allegedly signed by Grandier in exchange for power. The parchment contained strange symbols, the names of demons, and a supposed signature written in blood. Today it is widely recognized as a forgery, but at the time it was treated as one of the strongest pieces of evidence against him. In fact, the document was created by the exorcists themselves, clearly demonstrating the fabricated nature of the case. Meanwhile, at the Ursuline convent, the mass possessions continued. The nuns performed frenzied convulsions before crowds, convincing many that demonic forces were truly at work. But to modern historians, these performances bore the hallmarks of psychosomatic distress, religious pressure, and above all the psychological authority that Mother Superior Jeanne des Anges inadvertently wielded. She later wrote memoirs in which she admitted suffering from anxiety, delusion, and an intoxicating fascination with the spiritual power the exorcisms brought her. The outcome of the affair is considered one of the most grievous errors of the French religious courts. Urbain Grandier was sentenced to death and burned at the stake in 1634, despite the complete lack of credible evidence linking him to sorcery. Until his final moment, he maintained his innocence. His last recorded words were, "Lord, forgive them, they know not what they do." After Grandier's death, the exorcisms gradually faded. The nuns no longer experienced demonic fits. The collective hysteria ended almost as soon as the man accused of causing it was gone. This only strengthened the modern belief that the Loudun possessions were the product of psychological confinement, prolonged religious fear, and political motives hidden beneath a veneer of spiritual crisis. Today, the possessions at Loudun are seen as a profound lesson in the danger of fanaticism and the power of collective psychology. They show that when people live under extreme pressure, isolation, and religious fear, they can believe in phenomena they themselves create. And when political power wishes to exploit such circumstances, tragedy can fall on anyone, even an innocent priest. Although nearly 4 centuries have passed, the name Loudun remains a reminder that between religion, superstition, and power lies a thin and perilous boundary, where a single wrong step can turn an entire community into victims of their own fears. In medieval history, when people speak of sin within monasteries, they often think of dramatic scandals such as witchcraft, possessions, or power struggles. Yet there was a quieter, more subtle, and sometimes more frightening form of wrongdoing, one that persisted for centuries: the trade in fake relics. This was once the side business of more than a few monasteries, including communities of nuns who were believed to be holy and disciplined. What makes this story so compelling is its strange contrast. Women who lived behind stone walls to serve God, secretly enriching themselves through holy objects they manufactured with their own hands. In medieval Europe, religion was not only a matter of belief but the spiritual foundation of society. People believed that relics, a fragment of a saint's bone, a drop of what was claimed to be holy blood, or a piece of cloth said to have touched Christ's body, could bestow blessings, cure illness, or protect them from misfortune. The demand for relics was therefore immense. Genuine relics, however, were extraordinarily rare, and only major churches could afford to possess them. Between the enormous demand and the tiny supply, a black market began to flourish, and some monasteries, both male and female, quietly became the workshops of cleverly produced counterfeit relics. In many monasteries, especially those that were poor or lacked patrons, selling relics became an essential source of income. These objects were crafted from whatever materials were available. Animal bones filed down to resemble human bones, pig's blood diluted to create a holy colour, or simply scraps of old cloth scented with herbs and declared to be the shroud of some sainted woman. The remarkable thing is that the creation of such items was not always driven by malice. Sometimes the monasteries were so impoverished that they believed a harmless bit of fabrication could help keep God's house standing. Among those involved in this work were young nuns, those often tasked with manual labour in the convent. They may not have fully understood the consequences of their actions. Some simply thought they were performing their assigned duties, sanding bones, wrapping cloth, writing the word relic in elegant script. But there were also older or higher-ranking nuns who realised that relic trading was not merely a survival strategy, but a path to quick wealth. When people were willing to pay money in exchange for hope, objects that seemed worthless could suddenly become gold. Several French and German records from the 12th to the 15th centuries recount scandals involving nuns. In one case, a convent sold dozens of bone fragments, each claimed to belong to the same saint. An impossibility, since the total would have been enough to assemble 3 full skeletons. In Italy, there are accounts of nuns using animal blood mixed with perfume and wine, then proclaiming it holy blood fallen from the cross. One convent even claimed to possess a piece of the Virgin Mary's clothing, an absurdity, as Mary never set foot in Europe. Yet medieval people had no way to verify such claims. The nuns, meanwhile, needed only to say, "This is a miracle granted by God." The market for fake relics grew so rapidly that the Church had to issue repeated warnings and bans, though these orders often existed only on paper. When many monasteries depended entirely on this income to support dozens of nuns, it was difficult for them to abandon the practice. Some bishops looked the other way, others demanded a share of the profits, and so the deception persisted, becoming a hidden part of religious life. Modern historians, when analysing the documents, see a truth far more complex than simple wrongdoing. Some nuns participated because of economic pressure, some because they were ordered to, some believed that relics, whether genuine or not, still helped strengthen people's faith. Yet others openly exploited the trust of the devout. Church court records mention nuns who used relic trading profits to buy luxury items, from silver-embellished belts to costly fabrics, items considered wholly inappropriate for a life of austerity. The contrast between vows of poverty and the act of becoming wealthy fueled these scandals, sometimes damaging the reputation of entire monasteries. Punishments for selling fake relics varied across periods. In some cases, only the abbess was reprimanded. In others, chapels were dismantled and property confiscated. But the most serious cases saw entire convents dissolved, with nuns transferred elsewhere or confined for penance. To the Church, the trade in counterfeit relics was not merely fraud, it was sacrilege, a crime even more severe. Today, looking back, we see clearly that medieval monasteries were not places entirely removed from worldly concerns. They still faced financial pressures, questions of authority, and the basic need to survive. In such circumstances, even those who vowed to live pure, disciplined lives could find themselves drawn into actions they never imagined they would take. And so, amid the morning and evening prayers, there were quiet nights when nuns sat at wooden tables, carefully scraping a bone until it looked sufficiently holy. The trade in false relics remains one of the greatest hidden corners of medieval religious life, where sacred faith collided with very earthly needs. It is precisely this collision that produced stories both thought-provoking and revealing, exposing human nature beneath the monastic habit, where holiness and temptation coexisted within the silent stone walls of the convent. If the tale of nuns selling counterfeit relics shows that medieval convents were far from the sacred sanctuaries people imagined, then the scandal at Barking Abbey in England pushes that picture to a far more serious level. Here, one does not speak merely of quiet deceit, but of a whole sequence of scandals involving corruption, illicit relationships, internal rivalries, and political scheming. all taking place within one of the most powerful female religious institutions in medieval England. If France's Fontevraud was suspected of harbouring hidden violence, then Barking Abbey resembled a true kingdom of nuns, where power and intrigue often overshadowed prayer. Founded in the 7th century, Barking Abbey had, by the medieval period, become one of the wealthiest religious houses in England. The nuns living there did not survive on prayer alone. They managed vast lands, collected taxes from thousands of peasants, and maintained direct connections with the monarchy. The convent was led by an abbess, usually chosen from noble families. This meant the abbey was not just a place of devotion, but a centre of power. And when too much power accumulates within a closed community, scandal becomes almost inevitable. In documents from the 12th to 14th centuries, Barking Abbey frequently appears in the investigative records of the English Church, not for severe crimes like heresy or violence, but for embezzlement and corruption, often involving the abbess and senior nuns. It was recorded that the abbey's funds regularly disappeared under mysterious circumstances, especially in years when the abbess was young or inexperienced. Some nuns secretly funneled the abbey's money to their own families, or spent it on luxuries, behaviour wholly contradictory to the vow of poverty they once recited before the altar. It was not only money. Barking Abbey was also mired in rumours of illicit relationships, something rarely written openly in official documents, as the church preferred to hide such matters. But Barking was too large for everything to remain concealed. Certain records from the reign of Edward III mention nuns sneaking out of the abbey at night to meet outsiders. A few cases even involved male clerics from nearby monasteries. These incidents were usually handled quietly by transferring the nun to another convent for penance, yet the traces remain in chronicles that speak of the corruption of Barking. If the story stopped at moral misconduct, Barking Abbey might simply be regarded as a lax convent. But the most significant scandals lay in internal power struggles and political intrigue, where nuns not only fought for control within the abbey, but sometimes influenced royal politics as well. The position of abbess at Barking was extremely wealthy and powerful. Its holder managed enormous assets and wielded political influence across Essex. As a result, this office was a prime target for ambitious noble families. Each time an abbess died, the election for her successor became a genuine battle. Some records describe two nuns from rival noble houses secretly bribing church officials to secure the position of abbess. Certain disputes dragged on for years, forcing the church to send investigators. At times, Barking Abbey was almost paralysed, one faction barring the other from entering the chapel, while the other seized the storerooms and locked the refectory. Such scenes stand in stark contrast to the ideal of sisterhood in Christ. Yet the greatest power struggle in Barking's history occurred in the 13th century, when Abbess Matilda was accused of severe abuses of power. She was charged with imposing excessive taxes on peasants, hoarding silver and gold in her private chambers, and using abbey resources to support her aristocratic relatives. When the scandal erupted, she refused to resign and attempted to eliminate her rivals by isolating them from community life, even stripping them of the right to pray. The harshest punishment for a nun. The conflict lasted for years, and Matilda was eventually forced to leave the abbey. But the scandal permanently marked Barking as a place of intrigue and ambition. Nor were the conflicts confined to the nuns themselves. Barking Abbey also saw many covert political alliances. Some abbesses served as unofficial advisors to the monarchy, or helped arrange marriages for powerful families. This made Barking a key node in various struggles among noble houses. And when the convent became a battleground of political interests, matters of religious discipline naturally fell into the background. Today, when historians look back on Barking Abbey, They often describe it as a prime example of how a convent that becomes too wealthy and too powerful can easily fall into the grip of human ambition. The scandals of Barking were not the failings of a few individuals, but the inevitable outcome of placing nuns in positions of authority that far exceeded the original purpose of monastic life. From embezzlement and illicit relationships to political plotting, everything unfolded within stone walls intended to protect holiness. And so, following the story of monasteries selling counterfeit relics, Barking Abbey opens another chapter in the religious history of the Middle Ages, a chapter in which nuns were not only women of prayer, but sometimes figures as ambitious and calculating as secular lords. A convent once regarded as one of the most sacred in England is now remembered more for the scandals that tarnished both its reputation and the spiritual purpose for which it was founded. If other monasteries fell because of poverty or superstition, Barking Abbey fell because of power, the most irresistible temptation in any age. If the scandal at Barking Abbey shows how power could turn a convent into a hidden battleground, then the poisoning cases in Italian and French convents reveal an even colder truth. Silence. Crimes carried out in the shadows, without screams, without blades, only a cup of water, a slice of bread, a bowl of porridge. And then, a few days later, the victim lying weak in bed and dying amid prayers. To an outsider in the medieval world, it was simply death by illness. But in the surviving legal records, the truth was sometimes very different. In 14th to 15th century Italy, where convents often served as the centre of local communities, scattered accounts describe nuns quietly poisoning one another within the same cloister. One well-known case from Tuscany tells of a young nun, the daughter of a minor noble family who became the target of jealousy among older nuns because she was favoured by the abbess. She was given lighter duties, allowed access to the library, a rare privilege for a young nun. But such favouritism became a spark. When she died suddenly after several days of violent stomach pain, the record stated simply, "The victim suffered from an intestinal illness." Only when an internal investigation began did they discover a jar of unusual herbs in the kitchen, herbs commonly used to administer mild poison. In poorer convents, where competition was not about privilege but about inheritance, motives grew even more complex. Some nuns came from wealthy families and brought dowries with them. These offerings sometimes became objects of silent struggle. In a 15th century legal file from Bologna, one nun was accused of poisoning a fellow sister to claim the belongings that the victim intended to leave behind. The document describes the act as quiet as prayer, highlighting the chilling subtlety of the crime. Not all poisonings targeted members of the convent. Some were aimed at pilgrims who arrived seeking blessings or healing. A 13th century French document recounts how a group of pilgrims were given what was called holy healing water. Several fell ill immediately afterward. At first, people believed it was a plague, but a witness reported seeing a kitchen nun pour a strange powder into the water jug. The affair was smothered quickly. The victims buried in the convent cemetery, their deaths recorded with the simple note, "died of illness." The convent had no desire for an investigation, for any scandal could cost them the pilgrim donations they relied on for survival. One of the most famous cases comes from a convent in northern France in the 12th century. Here, a nun was suspected of weakening the abbess with slow poison, leaving her frequently ill and unable to govern. The accused nun was believed to be ambitious and hoping to take the abbess's place. When the matter surfaced, all parties denied everything. There was no firm evidence. Medieval medicine could not determine causes of death. The case closed in silence, and the suspect continued living in the convent for many years afterward. Overall, poisoning in convents was extremely difficult to detect and even harder to prove. In the medieval context, illness was the perfect explanation for any death. Someone vomiting? It was plague. Someone suddenly weakened? Poor hygiene? Someone dying in the night? God's will. With medicine still primitive, ignorance became the ideal veil for crime. Moreover, convents were closed communities. Everything that happened inside was dealt with internally, and only when a matter surpassed their ability to hide it did the church or authorities intervene. But even then, accusing a nun of poisoning another was risky. The church feared damaging the reputation of an entire religious community. Thus many cases were recorded only in vague lines such as suspected toxin, unusual symptoms, or death unexplained. Modern historians reading these fragments note something striking. Most poisoning cases share the same motives: jealousy, power, or property. This shows that even behind the stone walls of a convent, built on the ideal of abandoning worldly desires, human nature remained fully intact. Isolation, strict discipline, and the tension of communal living often intensified negative emotions. In a place where words rarely escaped the walls and conflicts were suppressed, outbreaks sometimes occurred in the most silent and dangerous ways. To modern readers, the idea of nuns killing one another with poison may seem shocking, but in the medieval world, poison was the most discreet method of solving problems. From royal courts to common households, its presence in convents is therefore not difficult to understand. Convents were not like those of today. They were self-sufficient communities, cooking their own food, growing their own herbs, preparing their own medicines. And this meant that the nun responsible for medical care, the one with knowledge of herbs, was also the one who held the ability to create toxins. When knowledge becomes power, crime can follow easily. Today, poisonings in convents are not well documented, partly due to lack of evidence, partly because the medieval church deliberately concealed them to protect its reputation. But the surviving legal records, even just a few thin pages, a few fading lines, are enough to paint a more honest picture of medieval monastic life. It was not only a place of prayer and austerity, but also a place where every shade of human nature existed, from the holy to the dark. And in these stories, poisoning remains a reminder that no matter how thick the convent walls were, no place could ever fully hide the depths of the human heart. When we imagine medieval convents, most of us picture places of peace, sanctuaries where women withdrew from the world, prayed, and sought spiritual calm. But in many periods of medieval Europe, especially in Italy, Germany, and England, convents held another function, the function of a political prison. These were places where women deemed inconvenient, dangerous, troublesome, or simply no longer useful to family interests were confined, and once the convent became a place of coercion, its darkness grew far deeper than the stories of rebellious nuns or internal rivalry. Here, wrongdoing did not always arise from malice. Sometimes it was born from circumstances that turned victims into culprits. From the 12th to the 15th centuries, many princesses and noblewomen in Europe were forced to spend their entire lives in convents, not because they wished to become nuns, but because they had become political pieces of no further value. A princess who could not be married into the alliance her family desired, a young widow considered too beautiful to remain at liberty, a daughter who displeased the court, all could be legally placed in a convent under the respectable pretext of serving God. A well-known example is the Carolingian princesses, often locked away in royal convents so that the court could avoid the risk of them becoming political tools in the hands of rival factions. A woman of royal blood, if allowed to marry, could create a new alliance that shifted the balance of power. So confining her in a convent meant closing off a dangerous path. Some noble families even placed their daughters in convents for financial reasons. Dowries for marriage were expensive, and when a family faced hardship, instead of marrying their daughter off, they simply sent her to a convent. Cheaper, easier, and free of scandal. But for these young women, the convent was not a haven of devotion. It was a life sentence rendered without their consent. Many grew up with resentment, loss of freedom, and strict surveillance. In such oppressive conditions, conflict, violence, and even acts of personal revenge began to emerge. Records from 14th century Italy recount a shocking case. A young nun was forced into a convent in order to settle a family land dispute. Because she resisted bitterly, she frequently violated discipline, attempted escape, and was eventually confined in isolation. Years later, she was accused of assaulting another nun in a rage. But when modern historians examined the case, they realized that the culprit was in fact a victim of prolonged coercion. The violence she committed was the outcome of years spent imprisoned against her will. This was far from an isolated case. In Germany, especially in Saxony and Bavaria, convents were commonly used to manage women deemed uncontrollable, too independent, too outspoken, or simply unwilling to accept an arranged marriage. Some were locked away for the crime of loving the wrong man, or the wrong class. In such conditions, violations committed inside convents were often exaggerated or even fabricated. One case from 13th century France tells of a group of nuns accused of poisoning their abbess, but investigation revealed that the accused sisters were all women who'd been forced into the convent by their parents. They were resentful, they were harshly treated, and the abbess's sudden death from illness was hardly unusual for the time. There was no clear evidence of poisoning, but because these women were known for their defiance, the record labelled them dangerous offenders. Over centuries, many historians have come to see this as a classic example of victims being transformed into criminals. Some cases carried even deeper political undertones. Convents were sometimes used by monarchs to confine individuals they did not wish to execute because a public execution could provoke backlash. A remote convent became a convenient solution. This happened to several noblewomen in England during the Wars of the Roses. They were held in lifelong confinement, forbidden to leave, denied contact with family, and often placed under the strict surveillance of abbesses loyal to the crown. Numerous documents describe these women gradually collapsing psychologically, leading to behaviour later described as madness or violence, after which historical records simply branded them as bad nuns. There were also women who entered convents voluntarily, only to be subjected to abuses of power that eventually turned them into unwilling culprits. One example from southern France tells of a nun who served as the infirmarian. When a plague swept through the region, she was blamed for failing to save enough patients. In the panic that gripped the community, she was accused of misusing medicinal herbs, even of murdering a wealthy woman to steal her donation. In reality, there was no evidence at all. She had merely become a scapegoat. Yet history preserved her name in the records as a criminal nun. And this was the tragedy of many like her. The failures of the system were blamed on individuals. One factor that made convents fertile ground for such injustices was their absolute secrecy. Outsiders did not intervene. Everything within the walls was handled internally by the abbess. If a woman resisted, she risked being labelled a violator of the rule. If she grew desperate enough to lash out, her actions were deemed moral collapse. Chroniclers rarely recorded the deeper causes, only the consequences, and thus many evil nuns in historical documents were in fact creations of a restrictive system. Today, when examining these records, historians often ask, in these cases, who was truly the offender and who was the victim? Were these dangerous nuns truly wicked, Or were they forced to play the villain in a political drama they never chose to enter? The answer is never entirely clear. But one thing is certain. When a convent is used as a prison rather than a place of holiness, the sanctity of the people within cannot survive. And the surviving stories, the blurred pages, the biased reports, reveal one truth. In the medieval world, the one imprisoned was not always the criminal, but often simply a woman unfortunate enough to be born into the wrong family, the wrong era, and the wrong place on the chessboard of power. What then truly led women who were regarded as brides of Christ to commit bold, wrongful, even cruel acts? The answer is not simple, but when we look beneath the surface of the surviving records and place them within their proper context, one thing becomes clear. All of these scandals were not merely the result of individual failings, but the product of a larger system. A system in which religious authority, political interests, isolation, and overwhelming expectations shaped human behaviour in deeply complex ways. First, it is essential to understand that medieval convents were not detached sanctuaries removed from the world, but integral parts of the competitive, conspiratorial, and unstable feudal order. Convents owned land, collected taxes, controlled labour, received donations, and sometimes even commanded military protection. All of this made a convent a seat of power, a kind of miniature state. And wherever there is power, familiar problems follow: rivalry, jealousy, corruption, manipulation, and struggles for status. An abbess wielded authority comparable to that of a man of similar rank, yet lived within a setting deemed sacred, where wrongdoing could be concealed beneath a religious veneer. Power that goes unchecked easily becomes temptation. Cases of selling relics, coercing the faithful, collecting illicit taxes, or covering up crimes all arose from such conditions. In this environment, nuns were not merely women of prayer, they were administrators, political actors, and power holders within a closed community. But power was not the only factor. Isolation was another major cause that many modern historians consider the root of convent scandals. Medieval convents were enclosed worlds, utterly cut off from life beyond their walls. For those who entered freely out of devotion, such solitude could be peaceful, but to those who were forced in, surplus daughters of noble families, young widows, women deemed politically dangerous, the convent became a psychological prison. Long-term isolation transforms the mind. Jealousy grows stronger, ambition intensifies, and the minor frictions of daily life accumulate until they erupt into acts of violence or wrongdoing. Many cases of poisoning, internal abuse, or even stories of possession were, in truth, expressions of stress, psychological strain, and pent-up frustration within a confined living space. When no escape exists, people must find ways to resist, whether quietly or dramatically. Another factor, often overlooked yet crucial, was the role of family and society. In the medieval world, many women had no control over their destinies. They might be forced into a convent because their family could no longer afford a dowry, because they married wrongly, or because they were sent away to avoid political complications. Many problematic nuns were in reality victims of circumstance. Their anger, resistance, or rebellion did not arise from nowhere. It was the natural consequence of having their freedom taken from them when they were barely more than adolescents. Actions that chroniclers later condemned as sins, such as attempts to escape, illicit relationships, rebellion, or defiance of the abbess, were sometimes nothing more than desperate reactions of women held against their will. In fact, many evil nuns were shaped by accusation rather than action. In legal records, any woman who opposed the wishes of the abbess or the church could easily be labelled rebellious, possessed, heretical, or immoral. An intelligent, independent, outspoken woman might be described as disobedient, simply because she refused to stay silent. A woman who dared question authority might be deemed dangerous. In such circumstances, the figure of the villainous nun was often created to maintain internal order rather than reflect truth. Yet it is also important to acknowledge an often ignored reality. Not all women were victims. Some of them learned to use their power, exploiting the convent system to achieve personal goals. An abbess commanding soldiers, a nun profiting from selling relics, or a woman manipulating worshippers with fabricated miracles, all demonstrate that medieval women were not passive bystanders in history. They participated in power, and some could build power of their own. What set them apart from men of the same era was not capability, but the rarity of documentation about them, and the fact that what records survived were often skewed, sensationalized, or filtered through the expectation that women should remain within prescribed roles. The important truth is this: the stories of notorious nuns dismantle the myth that medieval women were only fragile victims. When we look at figures like Benedetta Carlini, we see a woman with intelligence, ambition, and manipulative skill equal to any feudal lord. When we observe the powerful abbesses of Germany, we see genuine political leaders. When we read of conflicts inside convents, we see that women were not merely sufferers but also actors, sometimes even perpetrators. All of this makes history feel more real, because it allows us to see women as complete human beings, capable of goodness, wrongdoing, resilience, ambition, weakness, and tragedy. The dark side of medieval religious authority did not lie in the existence of sin, but in its ability to hide sin beneath sacred imagery. When convent was seen as a flawless institution, people easily overlook the truth that it was inhabited by human beings, complete with desires and faults. And when power merged with sanctity, it created an environment few dared to question. It was this silence that allowed wrongdoing to flourish, and made it difficult for later generations to distinguish victims from offenders. Looking back at all these stories, we understand that the misdeeds of nuns did not arise from a single cause. They were the product of abused power, prolonged isolation, social pressure, confinement, despair, and human nature under harsh conditions. Yet at the same time, they reveal that medieval women were not spectral figures drifting through history. They could be victims, but they could also be strategists. They were not merely swept along by events, they helped shape them with all the complexity and pain that entailed. And perhaps it is precisely this truth, that medieval women also had shadows, ambitions, power, and sins, that makes these stories so compelling. Because in them, history is not only the tale of kings or the church, it is the tale of ordinary people living in extraordinary circumstances, making choices that continue to captivate our imagination today. And now it is time to put your phone down and drift into sleep, my dear listeners. I wish you a peaceful night. Don't miss the next story tomorrow evening on the Medieval Dreams channel.